Imagine this: you're sitting at home, enjoying a quiet evening with your family, when a sudden knock at the door breaks the peace. You open it to find a dog. But not just any dog. It's a dog you've never seen before, with an odd look in its eyes, standing there as if it's waiting for something. No collar, no sign of a leash, just this strange animal on your doorstep, looking up at you with a gaze that seems almost knowing. You feel a chill run down your spine as you wonder, why is it here? This wasn't some random stray that wandered onto the property. There was something different about it, something that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. The dog didn't act like a typical animal. It didn't bark, it didn't whimper. It simply stood there, watching, almost as if it had a message to deliver. And then, just when you think you've figured out what's going on, it does something you can't explain. The family inside the house had no idea what they were about to face. The events that followed were more surreal than they could have ever imagined. Each step brought them deeper into a mystery that had no clear answer. The dog seemed to hold a key to something far bigger than just an animal looking for food or shelter. What happened next left them questioning everything they thought they knew about the world around them. At first, they tried to ignore the dog. Maybe it had gotten lost, wandered off from a nearby home. But the longer it stayed, the more impossible it was to ignore. Every time they looked out the window, the dog was there, staring. It didn't leave. And over time, strange things started happening. Unexplainable noises at night. Items in the house moving on their own. Whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. And it all seemed to happen right when the dog was around. The family, confused and unnerved, tried to figure out what was happening. Was it just their minds playing tricks? Or was there something more sinister at work? And what was the connection between this mysterious dog and the strange occurrences that had begun to unfold? Was it simply a coincidence, or was this animal somehow involved in something much darker? Just when they thought they couldn't take it anymore, the dog did something that made it all impossible to deny. Something so bizarre that it forced them to confront the truth they had been avoiding. But that's not where the story ends. In fact, it's only the beginning of a journey that would reveal secrets that no one could have ever imagined. The family is now caught in a web of mystery and danger, and they're not sure who or what to trust. The dog may have been the first clue, but as they dig deeper, they'll uncover far more than they bargained for. There are forces at work that no one, not even the most prepared, could have anticipated. So, what happens next? What truth will come to light, and will they be ready for it? The tension builds, and the questions pile up. And just when you think you've seen it all, something happens that takes the story to a whole new level. Will the family be able to survive the truth, or will they become part of a mystery that no one can solve? Stay tuned, because the next chapter is something you won't believe. As days went by, the dog's presence became more unnerving. It wasn't just a stray anymore. It was as if it had made itself at home. It was always there, waiting, observing. Sometimes it would be sitting by the porch when they woke up, other times, it would be standing by the window, staring inside with those strange, almost unsettling eyes. No one knew where it came from or what it wanted, but everyone could feel the strange tension building in the air. The family tried to stay calm, brushing it off as nothing more than a curious animal. They put out a bowl of food, hoping that it would simply eat and leave. But the dog never ate. It just watched them. The more they tried to ignore it, the more they felt like something was watching them, something much bigger than just a dog. There were nights when they could hear the faint scratching at the door, but when they opened it, the dog would be gone, only to reappear the next day, as if it had never left. It wasn't long before strange things began happening inside the house. Small at first, almost easy to dismiss. A glass would be found shattered on the floor, even though no one had touched it. The lights would flicker, just for a moment, as though there was a power surge. But that was only the beginning. One night, While everyone was asleep, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the house. When they rushed to check, nothing was there. No one had moved. But the feeling of someone or something lurking in the shadows was impossible to shake. One evening, when the family was gathered in the living room, a sudden cold swept through the house. The warmth in the air disappeared, and the hairs on their arms stood on end. They all turned toward the front door, and there it was again, the dog. But this time, it wasn't standing quietly. It was pacing, almost nervously, in front of the door. It would stop, then turn its head toward the window, then back to the door, as though it was trying to communicate something. The family started to feel like prisoners in their own home, each day bringing more questions than answers. They talked about it amongst themselves, trying to come up with a rational explanation. Maybe the dog had somehow become attached to their home, they thought. Perhaps it was just confused, lost, or in need of help. But there was an underlying feeling that they couldn't shake. Something was off. Then one afternoon, as the sun began to set, they heard a sound that sent chills down their spines. A low, rumbling growl. It wasn't coming from the dog. It came from somewhere deeper, somewhere hidden within the house. It was a noise they couldn't place, like something was lurking, just out of sight. They checked every corner, every room, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The growling stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving only an eerie silence hanging in the air. They knew they couldn't ignore it anymore. The strange occurrences were happening too often, and the sense of dread that hung over the house was impossible to ignore. The dog had been the first sign. But now, there were other signs, clues that seemed to suggest they were dealing with something far bigger, something beyond their understanding. One of the family members decided to take action. They started doing some research, looking into strange occurrences and supernatural phenomena that could explain what they were experiencing. But nothing prepared them for what they found. Old stories, urban legends about animals that were more than they seemed, guardians of secrets, protectors of ancient knowledge. The more they dug, the deeper the mystery became. What did this dog have to do with these tales? And why was it so intent on staying with them? But just when they thought they might finally uncover the truth, the dog did something that took everything to a whole new level. It led them to a place they never thought they would visit, a place that would turn their world upside down and force them to confront a truth that was far more terrifying than they could have ever imagined. The family was on the edge. Every step forward seemed to lead them into deeper darkness. Every new discovery raised more questions. And the dog, was it a warning, a guide, or something much darker? What was its purpose? And why had it chosen them? The tension was unbearable, and just when they thought they might get some answers, something happened that left them speechless. The dog, once standing on the doorstep, now disappeared without a trace. But its absence didn't bring relief. Instead, it made everything feel even worse. The house, which had already felt unsettling, now seemed empty, hollow, as though the dog had been the one thing holding it all together. And then, something they hadn't even considered happened. The family received a letter. A letter that carried with it a message they weren't ready to hear. But by the time they realized what it truly meant, it was too late to turn back. The letter was ordinary enough at first glance, just an envelope, plain and unremarkable. But the moment they opened it, the world seemed to tilt. The words inside were chilling, the handwriting unfamiliar, and the tone unmistakably urgent. "You've seen it, haven't you? The dog. It's not what you think. Don't trust it. You are being watched." There was no return address, no signature, just those cryptic words. The family stared at letter in disbelief. Who would send something like this? And how did they know about the dog? There was no way anyone could have known. Yet, the letter had arrived at their door without any sign of who might have delivered it. It felt like they were being drawn deeper into something they couldn't escape. As the days went on, tension within the house grew. The absence of the dog was now its own kind of haunting. The feeling of being watched, of something lurking in the background, didn't go away. If anything, it intensified. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind, every sudden sound at night seemed to echo in the silence, growing louder, more insistent. The house felt like it was closing in on them, like the walls were slowly moving in, and they were trapped inside. Each family member had their own way of dealing with the fear. One tried to pretend nothing was wrong, keeping a facade of normalcy, going about daily routines as if everything was just fine. Another grew restless, spending hours searching the internet for any answers, looking for any clue that might explain what was happening. And yet another became withdrawn, constantly looking over their shoulder, unable to shake the feeling that something, or someone, was always just out of sight. The letter hadn't been the end of the mystery, it had only been the beginning of something far worse. The night after the letter arrived, things began to escalate. Strange noises, low growls, the sound of scratching at the door returned, only now they weren't just coming from outside. They seemed to be coming from within the walls, as if whatever force had sent the dog was trying to make itself known in other ways. They could hear it moving through the house, the sound of claws dragging against the wood, the whisper of footsteps when no one was there. It wasn't long before they started seeing things. Flickers of movement at the edges of their vision, shadows that seemed to move on their own. Sometimes it looked like the dog was standing in the corner, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark, but when they turned to look fully, it was gone. The family couldn't tell if they were imagining things or if the house itself was playing tricks on them. But one thing was certain, they weren't alone. One night, driven by fear and desperation, one of the family members went out to the area around the house, searching for any trace of the dog, any sign of its presence. The search was futile, as there was no trace of the animal. No paw prints, no fur, nothing to suggest it had ever been there. The land around their home was quiet, too quiet, as if the whole world had suddenly stopped. But that's when it happened. As they stood by the trees, a shadow darted across their path, so quick, so sudden, they almost couldn't believe what they saw. Was it the dog? Was it something else entirely? The next day, the family noticed something even stranger. Their personal items began to disappear. First, it was small things, keys, a wallet, a phone charger, but the items never simply disappeared. They would reappear in strange places, far from where they had been left. A bracelet found on the kitchen counter, a pair of shoes placed neatly by the front door. It was as though something or someone was toying with them, moving their things around for reasons they couldn't understand. It was impossible to ignore any longer. Something was happening, something bigger than just a lost dog. The family was being pulled into a mystery they couldn't unravel. Who was behind the letter? And why was the dog so connected to all of this? Had it been sent as some kind of messenger, or was it something far more dangerous? Then, late one evening, another unexpected event took place. They were all gathered in the living room when the lights flickered again, and the house seemed to grow even colder. The dog they thought was gone appeared on the doorstep. It was standing there, staring at the house, but this time, it wasn't alone. A figure stood just behind it, barely visible in the dim light. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, as if it were waiting for something. The family froze. Their hearts raced in their chests as they stared out the window, too afraid to open the door. Who was the figure? What did it want? And why had it returned with the dog? That night, the family couldn't sleep. The silence in the house was unbearable, and every noise, no matter how small, seemed magnified in the dark. The unease grew with each passing hour, like the air itself was heavy with the weight of something that was about to happen. They couldn't shake the feeling that the dog had come back for a reason, and whatever that reason was, it was only a matter of time before they would find out. But were they prepared for what lay ahead? Were they ready to face whatever secret the dog had uncovered? And if they weren't, what would happen next? The clock ticked on, but with every passing moment, the tension in the house seemed to build. Something was about to change. Something that would leave them with more questions than answers, and more fear than they had ever known. The family didn't know how much longer they could keep living like this. Every night felt like a countdown to something inevitable, something they couldn't escape. The figure with the dog hadn't left. It hadn't moved, but it was there, always there, standing just out of sight, waiting. The dog, though it had once been a strange curiosity, now felt like a harbinger, a symbol of something darker that was slowly creeping into their lives. They couldn't ignore it anymore. They couldn't keep pretending that everything was just coincidence, or their imaginations playing tricks. Something was happening, and it wasn't just a random sequence of events. There was a pattern. The dog, the strange occurrences, the letter, it all seemed connected, like pieces of a puzzle that didn't make sense yet. But the longer they waited, the more urgent it became to find out what was truly going on. One night, a decision was made. The family would confront the dog and the figure, whatever it was. They couldn't keep hiding in the shadows, waiting for something worse to happen. But as they gathered at the door, ready to face whatever was outside, a deep feeling of dread washed over them. The air felt heavier than ever before, thick with anticipation. The very ground beneath their feet seemed to hum, as though the universe itself was holding its breath. The door creaked open, and there was the dog, just as they had seen it before, standing in the same spot, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. But this time, the figure was closer. It was standing just behind the dog, its shape now fully visible in the low light. It wasn't quite human, not entirely, but it wasn't anything they had seen before either. Its movements were slow, deliberate, almost like it was observing them, studying their every move. And as it stepped forward, the family could feel that this wasn't just an animal, and this wasn't just some strange person. Whatever this was, it was alive, and it was connected to something far beyond their understanding. A chill ran down their spines as they realized that they were no longer just observers in this strange situation, they were part of it. Whatever the figure and the dog were, they had been brought into this world, pulled into something much bigger than they could have imagined. The house, once a place of safety, now felt like a prison. And the dog? The dog was no longer just a mystery. It was the key. Without a word, the figure turned and began to walk toward the back of the house. The dog followed, its eyes never leaving the family, as if urging them to follow. Every instinct screamed at them to run, to get away while they still could. But they couldn't. They didn't know where to go, and there was no escaping the pull of whatever force was at work here. With heavy hearts and trembling hands, they followed, knowing they couldn't back out now. They walked through the house, through the hallway, and into the room where the mystery had first begun. It was the quietest room in the house, the one they had always used for storage, the one that had been untouched for years. But now, as they stepped inside, it felt different. The air was thick, suffocating. The room, once filled with dust and old memories, was now pristine. There was a strange energy in the room, one that made the hairs on their necks stand on end. In the center of the room, the dog stopped. It sat down, its eyes still locked onto them, waiting. The figure stood just behind it, unmoving, as if guarding the threshold between the family and the unknown. The family felt a sense of dread that was almost overwhelming, a pressure in their chests, as if they were being forced to confront something they couldn't understand. Suddenly, without warning, the lights in the room flickered. The temperature dropped even further, and the family could feel that something was about to happen. The shadows in the room stretched and twisted, moving on their own. The walls seemed to close in, as if the space itself was alive. And then, the dog let out a low growl, a deep, guttural sound that vibrated through their bones. It was a sound unlike anything they had heard before. The room felt like it was pulsing with energy, like the very air was charged with electricity. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow but deliberate, and the family instinctively backed away, unsure of what was coming next. But it wasn't until the figure spoke that the true horror of the situation sank in. Its voice was low, almost inaudible, but when it spoke, it sent a shockwave through the family, a message they weren't ready to hear. "You have been chosen," the figure said, its words almost too quiet to understand. "The dog is here to guide you, to lead you to your destiny. There is no going back." The room seemed to spin, and the family felt a wave of dizziness, as if they were being pulled into a place they didn't belong, a place where the rules of reality didn't apply. The growl from the dog grew louder, more urgent. The tension in the room was unbearable, each second feeling like an eternity. And just when they thought they couldn't take it anymore, the figure took one final step forward, and everything went silent. The dog's eyes glowed brighter, the shadows in the room deepened, and the family was left frozen in place, unable to move, unable to breathe. Whatever was happening now, they knew it was too late to stop. The door they had opened had led them here, and the only question now was, what was on the other side? The silence in the room was suffocating, as if time itself had frozen in place. The family stood motionless, unable to speak, their breaths shallow and quick. The figure's presence was overwhelming. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, seemed to pierce into them, probing their very souls. The growl of the dog grew louder, but it was no longer just a warning. It sounded almost like a command, urging them to understand something they hadn't yet grasped. The figure's voice cut through the tension, but this time, it wasn't words, it was a feeling that wrapped around their minds. It wasn't speaking directly to their ears but to their thoughts, a whisper in the dark that made them question everything they had believed about their world. "The time is near," the voice echoed, reverberating in the pit of their stomachs. "You are not the first to stand in this room. Nor will you be the last." A cold shiver ran down their spines. The family was no longer sure if they were hearing the voice of the figure or if it was something else, something deeper, something more ancient. And then, without warning, the lights flickered again, and this time, the shadows in the room seemed to move. They twisted unnaturally, stretching toward them, like fingers reaching out from the walls themselves. In that moment, something changed. The dog, once standing perfectly still, suddenly bolted forward, its eyes flashing with an intensity that was almost blinding. The family recoiled, unsure of what was happening. The figure didn't move. It simply watched, its expression unreadable. But the dog, it wasn't just a dog anymore. It was an agent of something darker, something beyond the realm of simple explanation. It circled the family, moving with unsettling speed, its growl shifting into something more like a chant, a low, rhythmic hum that reverberated through their bones. Then, everything went black. For a moment, the family was suspended in darkness, disoriented, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The room, once full of tension and mystery, now felt empty, hollow. The dog, the figure, and the strange presence that had gripped them were gone. They were alone again, or so they thought. But when the lights came back on, everything had changed. The room was no longer the same. The walls seemed to be different, as though they had shifted, rearranged, as if the very structure of the house had been altered. The air was thick with an unfamiliar weight, and when they looked at each other, they saw the fear reflected in each other's eyes. It was like they had stepped into a different world altogether, a place where the rules no longer made sense. And then, one by one, they began to notice it. The objects in the room were gone, replaced by strange symbols etched into the walls, the floor, even the ceiling. They were unlike anything they had ever seen before, a language they couldn't comprehend but could feel, deep in their core, that it was ancient and powerful. The symbols pulsed with energy, glowing faintly, and the air around them felt charged, like the world was on the verge of something catastrophic. A loud thud echoed from upstairs. It was a sound so sharp, so jarring, that it sent a jolt through their bodies. The family froze, their hearts racing as they turned toward the staircase. They hadn't heard any footsteps, no movement, yet the thud was unmistakable. Something was up there, and whatever it was coming closer. There was no time to think, no time to decide. One of the family members bolted toward the stairs, driven by the instinct that they had to find out what was going on. The others hesitated but quickly followed, their legs feeling heavy, as if the house itself was trying to keep them from moving forward. The stairs creaked under their weight as they ascended, the darkness seeming to grow thicker with each step they took. As they reached the top of the stairs, a sudden crash reverberated through the house. The sound of something or someone hitting the ground echoed from the hallway. They rushed forward, following the sound, their breaths ragged with fear. When they turned the corner into the hallway, they found nothing. No person. No figure. No dog. Instead, a door at the end of the hall was standing wide open. But it wasn't just any door. It was a door they had never seen before, a door that wasn't supposed to be there. The walls around it seemed to ripple, like the fabric of reality itself was warping. A strange light emanated from within, casting eerie shadows across the floor. The family gathered around, their hearts pounding in their chests. They didn't need to speak. They knew what they had to do. But what was on the other side of that door? And why had it only appeared now, after everything that had happened? One of them, trembling, reached for the door handle. And as their hand made contact, a sharp pain shot up their arm, as if the door itself was rejecting them. They pulled back, but the door opened on its own, swinging wide, inviting them into the unknown. As they stepped over the threshold, the temperature dropped drastically. The air was thick, suffocating, and the sound of whispers, soft at first, then louder, more frantic, rose around them. The family stood frozen, trapped in a nightmare, unsure of what they had just unleashed. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that this was just the beginning. What lay ahead was far worse than anything they had imagined. The dog, the figure, the strange events, it had all led them here, to this door, this place. And beyond it? The answer to everything. But was it an answer they could live with? Or would it destroy them all? Before they could take another step, the whispers grew louder, and the door slammed shut behind them, trapping them inside. The stakes had just risen, and there was no turning back now. The door slammed shut behind them with a deafening crash, the sound echoing through the dark, oppressive air. For a moment, the family stood frozen, their hearts pounding, eyes wide with fear as the whispers intensified. They couldn't make out the words, but they could feel the urgency, the warning buried within them. Whatever was behind this door was something they were never meant to discover, but now, it was too late to turn back. As they looked around, they realized they were no longer in the familiar space of their home. The walls seemed to stretch and pulse, as if they were alive, breathing. The floor beneath their feet felt unstable, almost like it was shifting. The temperature had dropped so low they could see their breath misting in the air. It wasn't just the room that had changed, it was everything. Time felt different, warped, as if it had been stretched into something unrecognizable. The family's fear only deepened when they noticed something in the far corner of the room. A figure stood there, motionless, bathed in an eerie, unnatural light. The figure was not the same one they had seen before. It was taller, its presence even more menacing, and it seemed to radiate an overwhelming sense of power. It didn't move, didn't speak, but the air around it crackled with energy. The dog, the one they had thought was just a strange part of their nightmare, was sitting at the figure's feet, its eyes glowing with an unearthly light. It wasn't just a pet anymore. It was part of something much bigger, something far darker. One of the family members stepped forward, their breath catching in their throat. "What do you want from us?" they asked, their voice barely a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile illusion of safety. The figure didn't respond immediately. Instead, it raised a hand, and the walls seemed to tremble. The symbols that had appeared on the walls of their house earlier flashed to life, glowing brightly. The whispers, now louder than ever, swirled around them, filling their heads with a confusing flood of thoughts. The words were not spoken, but they understood. It wasn't the figure that was the true threat, it was the force that had sent it, the entity that had been using the dog as its messenger. The family realized then that they weren't just being watched. They had been part of something much larger than they could have ever imagined. This wasn't just about a strange dog. It was about a world, another realm, perhaps trying to merge with theirs. The dog wasn't a random creature. It had been sent to guide them here, to this moment, to bring them to the threshold of something beyond their understanding. As the realization hit, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble, and a blinding light burst forth from the symbols on the walls. The family shielded their eyes, disoriented, unable to process what was happening. They could feel the world around them warping, shifting, as though the very fabric of reality was being pulled apart. And then, with a sudden, jarring snap, everything stopped. The light faded. The trembling ceased. The whispers died away. For a long, terrifying moment, there was nothing. The family stood there, breathless, unable to move, as if they were waiting for something, anything, to happen. The figure was gone. The dog was gone. The room that had felt so alive with energy was now completely still, empty, as if it had never been there at all. But it wasn't over. They weren't safe. Something still lingered in the air, something new. Something that had changed them. As they turned to leave, the door they had entered through was gone. There was no handle, no way to open it. It had vanished, as if it had never existed. Panic rose in their chests as they realized they were trapped. But before they could even process that, something far worse happened. A voice, soft and familiar, whispered in their ears. "We were never meant to leave." It wasn't the figure, and it wasn't the dog. It was one of them, one of the family, but it didn't sound like them anymore. The voice was wrong, distorted, like it was being forced through a veil of something alien. The family turned, wide-eyed, to find that one of them had changed. Their eyes were different now, glowing faintly in the dim light. The transformation was slow, unnatural, like something out of a nightmare. Before they could react, the figure, the family member who had been one of them, spoke again, but this time the words were chilling. "It's too late. You've opened the door." The family gasped in horror as they realized that the entity wasn't just trying to invade their world. It had already taken one of them. The transformation was only the beginning. What stood before them now was a reminder that the world they thought they knew had shifted into something they could no longer understand. The true horror wasn't the dog, or the figure, or even the strange symbols, it was the entity itself, a dark, ancient force that had been using them as pawns all along. They had thought they were the ones in control, but they had never been. And now, they were trapped in a world that wasn't their own. With a final, lingering look at the family member who had changed, they realized there was no way out. The door was gone. The world they knew was gone. And the only thing left now was the entity and the terrible truth that, in opening that door, they had unleashed something that would never let them go. As the last of their hope faded, the final twist became clear. It wasn't just their world that had been altered, it was themselves. And now, they were part of the darkness. Forever. The room, once filled with tension and a maddening cacophony of whispers and shifting shadows, now lay silent. The family stood frozen, horrified by the unexpected twist that had altered everything they thought they knew. One of their own had been transformed, their very essence now tainted by something beyond human understanding. The realization crashed down on them like a tidal wave. They weren't just dealing with a malevolent entity, they had become part of it. The figure, or what was once a member of the family, stood before them, eyes glowing with a strange, unsettling light. It wasn't the same person they had known. The voice was different, distorted, cold, and distant. The creature that had taken their loved one's form spoke again, and its words hit like a blow to the chest. "You were always meant to open the door," it said, its voice low, almost reverent. And now, the change is irreversible. The family recoiled in shock, but there was no escaping the reality of their situation. This wasn't just a nightmare. This was real. The entity, whatever it was, had already taken root within their lives. The door they had opened, the invitation they had unknowingly accepted, had led them here. And now, the world they had known was slipping away, replaced by something foreign and frightening. "We can't let it take any more of us," one of the family members whispered, voice trembling, breaking the heavy silence that had settled in the room. There was a sense of urgency now, of desperation. Whatever this entity was, it had already claimed one of them. But there was still time to save the rest of them. Or so they thought. But the creature, their loved one, now lost to whatever had taken control, just smiled, a hollow, vacant expression that held no trace of the warmth they had once known. It wasn't a smile of affection or familiarity, it was something darker, more predatory. "You cannot stop what has already begun," it said, its voice growing colder with each word. "You cannot fight what is already inside." It moved forward, its eyes locking onto the others, a cold, impenetrable gaze. The air in the room seemed to thicken with each step it took, like an invisible pressure building around them. It wasn't just a person who stood before them. It was a vessel for something far older, something far more powerful. The family's fear grew, their instincts screaming at them to flee. But where could they go? There was no escape. The door had disappeared. The house had become a prison, and the entity had already claimed its first victim. "We have to find a way out," one of the family members said, their voice sharp with determination. "We can't let it win." But even as the words left their mouth, a new realization hit. There was no winning here. The entity was already inside them all, like a parasite feeding off their fears, feeding off their vulnerability. It had been slowly seeping in from the moment they had opened the door, and now it was too late. The truth was undeniable. There was no battle left to fight. They had already lost. The figure reached out a hand, and the family felt an unnatural force pressing down on them. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in, the house itself conspiring against them. The air grew colder, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble, as if the house were shaking under the weight of something far worse than they had ever imagined. But then, something unexpected happened. A soft, almost imperceptible sound of tapping at the window. It was so faint at first, barely noticeable, but it grew louder, more insistent. The family turned, confusion and disbelief flooding their minds. The tapping grew to a rapid, urgent rhythm, as if it were someone or something trying to get their attention. Against their better judgment, they walked toward the window, their hearts racing. When they pulled back the curtain, they saw nothing at first. Just the empty darkness outside, a swirling black void where the world once was. But then, a figure appeared. A shadowy silhouette in the distance, moving closer, emerging from the darkness. The family gasped as they recognized the figure. It was the dog. But not the dog they had seen before. This was something else entirely. It wasn't just an animal anymore, it was a symbol. A manifestation of whatever force had been pulling the strings from the shadows. The dog stood outside, staring at them through the glass. Its eyes glowed with the same unearthly light that had possessed the creature in front of them. And yet there was something different about it now. Something more familiar. It wasn't just guiding them anymore. It was offering them a choice. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the family felt a glimmer of hope. There was something in the dog's gaze, something that suggested there was still a way out. It wasn't too late to stop the transformation. It wasn't too late to reclaim their lives. One of the family members, desperate, reached out toward the window, pressing their hand against the cold glass. The dog's gaze never wavered. The figure behind them, the one who had once been a part of their family, turned toward the window as well, its eyes narrowing. "You don't understand," the creature hissed. It's already too late. The door was only the beginning. The darkness has already claimed you. But the family didn't listen. They couldn't. This was their chance. Their last chance. In unison, they turned and rushed toward the door, the one that had vanished earlier. As they reached for the frame, they felt it again, the pressure, the weight of the entity pressing down on them, trying to stop them from leaving. But this time, they didn't falter. They pushed forward, with everything they had. The door swung open with a force that made their hearts leap in their chests. Beyond the threshold was not the room they had come from, but something else entirely. A swirling vortex of light and darkness, of time and space bending in on itself. The dog's eyes glowed brighter than ever, and it seemed to beckon them forward, urging them to step into the unknown. With a final, desperate glance at the creature that had once been their family, they stepped into the vortex. The world around them seemed to collapse, pulling them into a space where the rules no longer applied. The last thing they saw before everything went dark was the dog waiting for them, guiding them towards something beyond the grasp of their understanding. And then, there was nothing. The family awoke in an unfamiliar place, surrounded by nothing but a vast, endless expanse. The air was calm still. They looked around, but there was no sign of the entity, no sign of the house they had once called home. For the first time in what felt like forever, they were free. But the question lingered in their minds: was this freedom, or was it another part of the same nightmare? The dog was gone, but the knowledge remained. They had made it through. They had fought, and they had survived. But at what cost? As they looked at each other, each of them knew that the world they had once known was gone. The door they had opened had led them here, to a place beyond their comprehension. The dog had been their guide, their salvation, but also a reminder that some forces are far beyond human control. The entity, whatever it was, had left its mark on them, and they would never be the same. In the end, they had learned the most difficult truth of all: some doors, once opened, can never be closed again.